So, hello everyone. I'm Gillian Dow, and I am speaking to you at the end of the first week of our online course, Jane Austen, Myth, Reality, and Global Celebrity. And it's lovely to be joining you virtually today. I teach English literature at the University of Southampton, as you'll have worked out from following the progress of the course this week. And I want to introduce you to one of our about to be third year students, Asha. Asha, do you want to say a little bit about, say hello and who you are and what you've been doing on the course this week?
Yeah, hi. My name's Asha. I'm just finished my second year studying English at the Uni of Southampton. And this week, I think the most interesting thing I found is looking through the database of readers and seeing, yeah, exactly who was reading Austen and what people were thinking about novels at the time.
Yeah, it's one of the things I like the best about week one is introducing people to these resources, which are completely open access, free to access. Anyone can use them. They are not linked to the course. So if you make a note of where these resources are, you can absolutely use them in the future again. And you're talking, of course, about the reading experience database, which tries to track how people read and how they responded to that reading through the ages. So, of course, Austen is in there, but she's not the only person to be in there. So, what were you making of people's readings of Austen this week, Asha, as you were looking at them?
Well, I thought it was interesting. Some of the reviews of the novels tended to be a bit condescending. And lots of them said things along the lines of, oh, for a novel, it was okay.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the key things that people should remember actually is that when Jane Austen started to write in the 1790s, the novel as a genre was extremely new. People were still trying to work out what its capacities were, what the potential was for the novel, and it was not at all as distinguished a genre as writing, say, plays or poetry or history. You know, that was the reputed genres, and novel writing was seen to be in some ways lesser, inferior, and there's a lot of that negative attitude to Austen's to novel writing that comes across in Austen's fiction, of course, in her novel Northanger Abbey, which was posthumously published, so very late to be published, but very early to be written. There's a lot of negativity towards the novel in that novel, not from the narrator, not from Jane Austen herself, but from several of the other characters. And, you know, there's this sense that for a young woman to be reading novels would be to waste her time. So when you look up the published reviews of Austen's fiction, you're absolutely right. There is this sense of it's all very well for a novel, but we don't expect much from novels. And I think that's Austen's great innovation, isn't it? Is to come in with the novel genre and say, this is a genre that can do great things, that can change minds, that can explore feelings. This is great art. It was not considered to be great art when she was publishing. So what were you making when you had a look at the reading experience database about the kind of issues of Austen's readers? Are they all middle class ladies in expensive drawing rooms?
Yeah, well, I think it's definitely from the data that we have data from people who are able to keep and preserve their records. But yeah, there's definitely a gap in data from those who are lower class. And I suppose the question is whether they actually weren't reading her novels or whether that just wasn't recorded or wasn't passed down.
Yes, I think that's the key thing, isn't it? Any database is only ever as good as the data we put into it, and there's so much that we don't know about Austen's readers, especially in her lifetime. You know, there's often this misconception, I think, in some ways. One of the myths we want to challenge is that Austen wasn't popular in her lifetime. That's not quite true, actually. She wasn't a best-selling author in her lifetime. Her contemporaries, Walter Scott, Frances Burney, Maria Edgeworth, and Radcliffe, really outsold her and in significant numbers. But she did quite well. You know, she made money from her fiction. She was delighted to be making money from her fiction, and her works were read. And by the time she died, and remember everybody that she died very, very young. You know, she was only 41 when she died and just getting going, really. You know, this massive period of productivity in that run up to her death, where, you know, she's publishing a novel every year or every 18 months. And who knows what she would have gone on to do after that. But she died very young, and she was building up at that stage a pretty reputable, you know, and distinguished readership. For Walter Scott to write a review of Emma, and a fairly major review of Emma, was a big deal, actually. You know, for Byron's publisher to choose to publish her and to lament her death was a big deal also. So this is someone whose reputation was building even during her lifetime, and who continued to have this sort of reputation amongst discerning readers throughout the 19th century. But yes, the records, as far as is a domestic servant reading Pride and Prejudice in the 1840s, we simply don't know, but perhaps.
Yeah.
Anything else you noticed this week that was of interest to you, or perhaps some of our other participants who've been commenting this week?
Well, I think what's always interesting is looking at the circumstances of Austen's life and how they influence her novels. I think there's always been a huge amount of attention to Austen's life, in part because people have liked to characterize her as a very closed-minded woman and tried to explain her living situations in that way. But I think there's been a lot of interest in some of the more like niche areas of her life. For example, like the embroidery that she was doing at home, or what her physical handwriting looked like. Because also we just have so many unanswered questions. So to be able to think in a bit more detail about what she would have been like is obviously very interesting.
Absolutely. There's a couple of direct questions about that, which I'll come on to in a second. But I think your point about the manuscripts is a really interesting one. People always love to look at her handwriting and always
Yeah.
love to look at the manuscripts. And the sad thing is that there are very, very few of them. Anything that she published, the manuscript simply wasn't kept. I suppose we now put a very high value on manuscripts as material artifacts, but when Austen was writing, the published book was the thing of value. You know, you didn't need to keep your manuscripts because the published book superseded it. So there is no manuscript of Pride and Prejudice. There is no manuscript of Sense and Sensibility. There is a section of Persuasion, the section that she didn't publish, and there's of course manuscripts for all the juvenilia. And I really would encourage people to read that online, because I think that's where we see the exuberance of the author at its height, really. And someone asked a question about punctuation, about her use of dashes. One thing Jane Austen is brilliant at, and seems to have always been brilliant at, is dialogue. And she punctuates that with dashes throughout. So to see that on the page, I think, gives us a real sense of what she found easy and what she might have found harder. The manuscripts show us lots of crossings out and rewritings in descriptive passages, but almost never with dialogue. The dialogue seemed to flow very, very freely, and be punctuated very freely as well. And of course, we need to remember in this period that spelling isn't really fixed any more than punctuation is. This is still a period of some flux. So when Jane Austen writes friendship, she always writes FREIND, love and friendship, one of her works of juvenilia being a notable example there. But yeah, I think your point about Jane Austen really enjoyed kind of playing with language in that way is an important one. And there were these two questions, I've got them written down here. Two different participants in the course asking, did she ever write herself into one of her stories? Did she use herself as a character? Did she write her family or friends as characters? And then someone else saying, do we see her building her characters with qualities of life that are important to her? So in some ways, two related questions, but very, very difficult to answer. Biographical approaches to an author are, I think, always more prevalent in the work of women writers, actually. You know, we want to apply these biographical readings more to Jane Austen than we do to, say, perhaps Charles Dickens, although there's certainly a lot of interest in Dickens's relationship with the woman in his life, etc., etc. But with Jane Austen, I think there is this perception that she led such a quiet life. And how could a spinster possibly have written these great love stories unless she'd experienced them for herself? And there has been a reasonable amount of indulgence in that approach via, well, I don't know if you've seen the biopic Becoming Jane. It came out in 2007 with Anne Hathaway playing a young Jane Austen and really transposed the character of Lizzie Bennet onto Jane Austen herself, and Mr. Darcy as Tom Lefroy. And, you know, we just know so very little about Jane Austen's life. There are hints and glimpses in the letter, but nothing really is unmediated in this this kind of perception of what the details of her life and her biography is always mediated by family members and indeed by herself. She doesn't keep a private secret diary. She writes letters to her sister Cassandra. So already there's an audience, even if that audience is your sister, even if the audience is someone who's extremely close to you, there's still a layer of mediation there. So I can understand why people want to know, did she write herself into her stories? I can't answer it, and I'm sort of reluctant to, actually. I think any writer, any novelist, you know, in the 21st century will tell you that they observe certain things and use certain things in their fiction, but these are not autobiographical stories. These are fiction, and she worked very hard at making it fiction. On the question of do we see her building her characters with qualities of life that are important to her? That's a really interesting question. Certainly, many of her novels, and I suppose I would point to Mansfield Park in particular, which is going to be more of a focus on other weeks. Many of her novels are exposés of moral worth, what it means to be a moral and thinking person in the 19th century, explorations of faith. What does it mean for Fanny Price to be a devout Christian and for Edmund Bertram to be joining the church? They're about education too. I mean, I think if there's one unifying theme across the novels, it's the importance of female education. She doesn't quite come down on the side of any particular educationalist in the period, but certainly her heroines always have some kind of education or always seek to be more educated. They're all great readers, for one thing, which I think Austen sees as very important. So yes, I hope that there's plenty for people to keep thinking about. I mean, this is certainly a course that invites more questions than it does answers. Is there anything else, Sasha, that you think we should have picked up on from what people were commenting? I think our participants this week are quite shy and reserved, perhaps, and that they're following along and not commenting that much. Anything else we should have said, do you think?
Well, I think I mean, I've just been thinking a lot in terms of like Jane Austen on a global scale. And even though maybe this time, now that the course has run for so long, we have less participants, like the map at the beginning of all the different people who've taken the course and everywhere in the world that they've come from, I find really interesting because, again, thinking about Jane Austen's life and like how people try and paint it as very narrow and particular in all kinds of ways, maybe doesn't reflect the kinds of international appeal that she has. So definitely will be interesting to keep thinking about why that's the case over the next few weeks.
Absolutely right, Asha. And next week, of course, we'll be inviting people to think about celebrity in relation to Austen and global celebrity too, which can sometimes be quite provocative. People resist thinking of her as a celebrity, but she's certainly a celebrity now, whether or not she intended to be one in her own age. So we'll look forward to carrying forward the conversation over the next 2 weeks. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.